Hello. In this video, we're going to introduce you to the ACT math section. How's it organized? What do you need to know about it? How do you prepare for it? And what is our strategy to approach it for each time? So let's get right into it with some things that you need to know first about the section before we get into the details. First of all, you're allowed to use a calculator for the whole thing. There is no non-calculator section like there is in the SAT. For the ACT, you will always have your calculator for the math. Just double check on the ACT's website that your calculator model is allowed. Certain ones, especially the newest with a lot of extra features, might not be allowed, but otherwise, as long as yours is allowed, you're fine to use whatever you want. Again, check the website. It'll tell you what's allowed and what's not. Next, the entire thing is multiple choice with 5 options on every question. Again, big difference for the ACT and SAT. The SAT is going to have some write-in questions where you just have to solve it. On the ACT, the entire thing is multiple choice. So you always have a chance to at least guess. And no, wrong answers will not go against you. So if you have no idea, just flat out guess, see if you can eliminate, and move on. Some of the questions will be grouped. For the most part, every question is its own individual thing, but every now and then you're going to see, typically somewhere in the middle of the test, a little blurb saying, for questions 31 to 35, use the following diagram or following information, and they're going to give you some kind of info. That's how you know whatever they're about to tell you, that actually is going to be used for that chunk of questions. There's not a lot of those, but just know they will be there so you're not thrown off when you see it. The questions will get harder as you go along. So unlike the English, which we covered earlier, where everything's the same difficulty through the whole thing, math and also science, they get harder as you go. So that will happen, and we're going to have strategies on how to deal with that. There are a lot of things that are tested in the math section, which is annoying, but don't panic. You don't actually need to know all of it to do well. This is the most forgiving section when it comes to scoring. You can actually do quite well while missing several questions. It's okay. And in fact, we're going to have some strategies to help you get some of these answers without knowing how to do the math that they're testing. Because really, you just need to know what answer is right so you can bubble the right bubble. You don't necessarily need to know how to solve it correctly. They're not going to know. It's not like your tests in school. You just have to know which bubble to circle or fill in. And the last, less fun thing is that improvement in this section does tend to be slower than in other sections, just because there's so much that they're testing. But it does tend to be a bit more of a steady improvement. So you're less likely to just be stuck there forever at the same score. Whereas something like science, it might take a bit for you to figure out what's going on, and then your score can jump a lot faster. But because of that, this is usually the last section I recommend focusing on. Definitely be sure to leave time for you to get there, but this is typically going to take the longest. So see if you can get everything else up first, because you don't necessarily have to have the best math score if all your other scores will average out your total ACT score and pull up your math. Or if you are strong with math, keep in mind it might be able to pull up something that's weak. So it's okay to have a weak section. All right, so the layout and pacing for this test, there are 60 questions and you have 60 minutes to answer them, which doesn't sound like a lot, but one really easy math problem is how many minutes does that give you per question? 1. On average. Because remember, the questions get harder towards the end. So if possible, try to go faster early on in the test so you can bank some of that time for the harder questions where you're going to need that time. To give you an idea of how to pace it, we're going to try splitting that test into halves or thirds, just according to whatever you're more comfortable with or whatever works for you. Try them both out. If you're going to go into halves, aim for about 20 to 25 minutes in the first 30 questions. Then in the last 30 questions, you'll have 35 to 40 minutes. For thirds, you do the first 20 in 10 to 15 minutes. Do exactly a minute per question in the middle, so 20 minutes for the middle 20. And then for that last 20, you'd have another 5 to 10 minutes. And all of this is a rough guide. These numbers vary a lot per student. You'll have to figure out what works best for you according to what your target math score is. Look up what colleges you're interested in, what their average scores are. If you have to go for an extremely high math score specifically, you might want to try something more like this one, where you're pushing for a much faster in the first third, so you have more time in the last third, so that way you can get to those higher questions. But if you don't necessarily need those insanely high scores, you can maybe go for something more like the halves, where you can spend more time early on, and it's okay if you miss more and run out of time in the back half. Find what works for you. Now, one important thing to do, or keep in mind, with all of this pacing, I know I'm saying go fast, make sure you have time. Don't ever go so quickly that you start losing accuracy. Because if you start going so fast that then you misread or make math errors and miss, let's say, question 6 and 8, which were super easy and you definitely knew what you were doing, but you goofed up and you missed those now because you were just going too fast. The time that you just saved on those two problems is probably not going to make the difference for you to now get more than 2 more right in the hard questions that you would have gotten earlier. So you're probably just hurting your score by going that quickly. So even if that means you run out of time or you have to make some more guesses in the last 20, it's okay. You just have to find where that balance is for you. Try to get faster, practice to be able to get faster more accurately, but make sure you find out where that wall is so that you're not going to the point where now you're hurting yourself. So how should we best practice and prepare for the section? You're ideally going to want to find a balance between studying some source that tells you, here's the stuff you need to know for the ACT. It could be the videos that I plan on making. It can be ACT's website, their own prep books. It could be other videos, other websites. But it is kind of nice to have something that just lays out the formulas for you. The problem with those is they can be very intimidating with all of the stuff all at once, and you don't know where to start, what to prioritize. So make sure that you don't overwhelm yourself there. You're going to want to balance that with actually practicing. Because knowing all the stuff is great, but you need to know how to pace yourself. You need to know how to handle how the ACT actually phrases their questions and what kind of stuff you see. And if you do enough of these, you're going to run into the concepts a lot, and you'll get an idea of what you need to know that way, as long as you take the time to go and look up, well, how was I supposed to do these? And you'll kind of fill in the concepts that way. So balance these out. If you're overwhelmed by all the concept stuff, that's okay. Focus more on getting practice tests and finding explanations that showed you how to solve them, and you'll pick up the bulk of the concepts that way. Because I find this is the biggest hurdle for most students when they get that big ACT prep book. It's gigantic. They go to the math section like, how on earth am I going to learn all this? And they just give up. So don't worry about that as much as the actual practice. Kind of fill those others in as you go. And as you are studying these concepts, focus first on the early ones, things you're going to see in the first half of the test. As you get those and you're more comfortable with them, you'll A, build confidence because it's stuff that you'll be able to add up pretty quickly because they're simpler and things you probably already know or just needed a refresher. And B, it'll start building up that score. Because again, as I said, you don't need to get everything right. So if you can get a strong foundation of the early stuff, you can get a pretty good score just from that. Then you can start building in those later concepts after you've got that foundation. Prioritize the first 40 questions and the things you see there for a couple reasons. A, these tend to be more consistent where they're just testing, do you know how to solve this? And you're going to see a lot more repeats or repeated concepts. Once you get to the last 20, it gets a lot more convoluted and complicated with things that you don't see very often. There might be some things that are seen more frequently, but they're normally much more challenging. And again, you can get very good scores without having a good last 20, which you might think is ridiculous because it's a whole third of the math section. But again, I'll give you an idea. Every test is scored differently on a curve, so getting 40 right on one test won't give you the same score as 40 right on the next test. But in general, if you were to say get a perfect first 40 and not even try the last 20, you can still get a score in the mid 20s, which is pretty good. If you just get half of that last 20 right with a good first 40, you can get all the way up to a 30 or lower 30s, which is very good. So you don't ever really have to master those super hard questions in the last 20 unless you're really going for those near perfect scores. So prioritize the first 40 and you'll be fine. Though a little tip, learn matrix math and expected value. I'll make a video on just those two early on because almost all the tests, not all of them, it's not a guarantee, and it's always a shifting thing, but most of the tests are going to have one question from each of these, and they're almost always going to be towards the end of the math section in that hard part. Not because the math is super hard, it's because nobody knows how to do these. So they're all in the later section. So if you do learn how to do them, they're actually pretty simple questions that you can get right most of the time. They're kind of two freebies on what's supposed to be a really hard part of the test. As you are practicing, though, practice good pacing habits. So you don't want to get in the habit of just taking your time and solving all of the questions out all the way super slowly. So don't spend too long on one problem. Guess or skip if you have to, especially those last 20 questions or last 30, depending on where you are. That's perfectly normal and expected, and in fact, a good idea to skip. If you're really struggling with your pacing, try individually timing every question and write down your time for each one, and that'll help you get an idea of how long are you taking on each type of problem, and you'll help develop that internal clock to know, just kind of with a gut feeling, I've been taking too long on this problem, I need to move on. And then after you've solved things, go back and see if you can use some other strategies to get your answer other than what you did. So instead of doing the math, could you have used plugging in the answers they give you? Could you have made up numbers and tested them? I'm going to go into these three main alternative strategies here in this video a little bit later. Really try to master identifying the types of opportunities or questions where you can use these strategies. Because what that's going to let you do is answer questions regardless of if you know the math that's being tested or not. And it might be even faster than doing the math properly. So if you can really master these strategies, that's where you're going to see consistent improvements regardless of whatever they're testing. So the strategy, when you're actually taking the test, this is going to sound very familiar to some stuff I just said, but speed's very important. But focus on accuracy more than speed for those first 40 questions. And again, that number will shift for every person depending on what your strength is in the math section and what target score you're at and where you are in your prep. Early on, you might be trying to focus on the first 20, then 30, then 40. But usually first 40 is good enough. You don't have to go past there unless you're really targeting super high scores. Then for that last 20, after you get past these, then you're going to shift your strategy to where you're just going to pick and choose. Find the questions that you think you can solve quickly or with those alternative methods I'm going to talk about. Then you can go back and fill in the others. That way you don't risk running out of time when there's still some easy ones that you could have done. So just keep that in mind that you're going to have a kind of a shift. You always want to keep this in mind, even if you're in the first 40. If there's something you just don't know how to do, it's okay. You still want to just guess and move on. You can come back if you've got time later. So don't be afraid to skip or guess on problems, especially in math. It's the most forgiving section. Always look for opportunities to use those alternative methods that, again, I'm about to go into those. They might be faster, and you might be able to answer questions that you didn't think you'd be able to. And finally, take advantage of the fact that you have a calculator. Don't try and do math in your head. It can do it faster and more accurately for you. And if you're good with your calculator, you can take advantage of some of the other features in there, like MathFrac, which will convert decimals to fractions, so you don't have to simplify fractions anymore. It can also graph things for you. And if you're good with using zeros or intercepts, it can solve equations for you. It can solve scientific notation problems by just putting it in scientific notation mode if you know how to do that. So I do recommend you get comfortable with your calculator. I might make a video just on some general tips, but every calculator is a little different. So finally, let's get to those alternative methods I was talking about. Again, these are just new ways to get your answer without actually knowing how to do the math that they're testing. They might be faster, or they just might let you answer a question that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And there's three main ones. Plugging in the answer choices that they give you, because one of them has to be right. Just outright making up numbers and testing them out with the answer choices. And finally, just drawing stuff. Simple shapes, especially triangles, wherever you can. These will feel weird and take some getting used to, so really practice them, because it's not like your usual math test in school where they're going to try and test, do you know how to solve this? And your teacher's going to care about you showing your work. Here, there is no showing your work. You just bubble in the bubble, and that's all they see. So as long as you can get to the right bubble with one of these, it's the same thing. So let's get right to it. Plugging in answer choices. What I mean by that is you're going to just try out all the answer choices that they give you. One of them has to be right, so just try them out. This could be used in a lot of different scenarios. I can't possibly show all of them, but in general, if you have exact numbers in your answer choices or you're solving for a single variable, that's a good sign you could probably do this. You can do it in other things as well, and not always in these scenarios, but this is kind of your most usual sign. Just some advice, start with the middle option when you're plugging these in, unless you're solving for a minimum or maximum, as long as your answer choices are in order like they normally are. And I'll show you in the first example why that is. But the idea is if you start in the middle, at most you only have to try 2 answer choices instead of 5. But if you are asked for a minimum, start with the smallest option and work your way up. So the first one that works, you can stop there because it was the minimum. Opposite for the max. If they are asking what's the maximum value of something, start with the largest option and work your way down. So the first that works is your answer, and you can stop there and save time. So let's just jump right into an example. This is the simplest example out there to show what the classic example of plugging in answers works, because I have a formula here where I have one variable I'm solving for and nice exact answer choices. So x has to be one of these. So if I wanted, I could do the math and solve for x correctly, or I can realize, well, x is one of these 5 things. So I can start in the middle, like I said, and just plug 11 in for x right there. So if I put 11 in at x, I get this. Do that math, and you'll get 2 to the 29, and that's 2 to the 15 on the right-hand side. I just keep rewriting. It's right there. You can see right off the bat, those two things are not going to be the same. And if you don't recognize that, I put those in your calculator, and you'll realize right off here, this gigantic number does not equal this littler number. So 11 did not work. Not only that, but this side where I put the 11, it's way too big. So if C is too big, then D and E are definitely too big. So by starting in the middle, I just got rid of 3 answer choices right off the bat. So now I can go to the next one, B, and try that one out. So now I'm going to put 4 in for X. So if I put that in here, you get 2 to the 15 equals 2 to the 15. That works. So B is my answer. If it still didn't work and B was too big, I don't have to plug in A because it would be the last one. So even if I try C and it doesn't work, and I try B and it doesn't work, I still only had to try those 2 and I had my answer by starting in the middle. That's why we do that. Here's another example from later in the test. There's almost always some kind of trig rule or unit circle problem in the last 20 that a lot of people miss because it's very hard to memorize all that stuff, but I usually don't recommend my students do memorize them because you can almost always solve these problems by plugging in the answer choices they give you or making up some numbers and testing things out. So if you look at this one, if I don't know how to do any of this or any of the rules to rewrite this, I'm fine because I can just plug all these into my calculator. Just make sure whenever you're doing trig, so sine, cosine, or tangent in your calculator, that you put it in the right mode, degrees or radians. If you look here, I'm in degrees, so I need to make sure I'm in degrees mode. If you don't know how to change that in your calculator, look it up. Most of the time, you're just going to hit mode, and then find the option to go between DEG, which is degrees, or RAD, which is radians. So in this case, you want to be in degrees. It's the only time it matters is with sine, cosine, tangent, those trig functions. So if I just put this into my calculator, you get 1. So which of the following expressions is equal to that? Well, now I'll just put all these in my calculator. Here we go. And here's what you get. J is the only one that gives me 1. So that's my answer. Did I do any trig? Did I know anything about the trig rules that they are testing here in the hard part of the math test? No. I just put my calculator into degrees mode, plugged in what I'm supposed to get, and then put in all my answer choices until one gave me what I'm supposed to get. And that's all you have to know. Let's look at another weird one, just to show how you can get creative with this. In this one, they want us to get the prime factorization of 30,030. So if you know how to do prime factorization, great, go for it. That might take you a while, unless you're good at it and realize why they're giving you this. But we could also use our strategy here by recognizing for prime factorization, these are all getting multiplied. They all have to multiply up to 30,030. So if I just put all these in my calculator, just multiply them out, like 3 times 7 times 10 times 13, here's what you get for all of them. Realize only 3 of them actually give me 30,030. So I got rid of A and C right off the bat, so it has to be B, D, or E. Then I can just figure out what the difference is between them. For it to be prime factorization, I need my answers to be all prime numbers. But notice, I can get rid of B and D because B has 30, and D has 10. Those are not prime numbers. So my answer has to be E. So did I have to prime factor this huge number? Nope. I just used my calculator, plugged in the answers they gave me, and then got rid of anything that didn't have all prime numbers. And I have my answer in a matter of seconds. So that's plug-in answer choices, very helpful. Now let's go to the making up numbers strategy. This one is weird because it takes some getting used to. It's not like anything you've ever done before. It's also often the most useful because it can be used in such a wide variety of problems. If you get really good at it, it can make a huge difference. So what do I mean by making up numbers? It's kind of what it sounds like. We're just going to pick a number, make them up, and we're going to plug those into the problem, whatever expression there, and into all our answer choices and see which one works or what are equal. And it'll make a lot more sense as you see these. I'll also try to point them out in all of my example tests. So watch those and look for where I use this strategy. Again, you can use it in a ton of different ways, but 2 of the biggest things to look for is equivalent to. If you see that expression in your question, you can almost definitely use makeup numbers. Or if your answer choices have expressions or inequalities, there's a decent chance you'll be able to make up numbers for that. Those aren't the only scenarios, but those are the big ones. General advice, when you are just picking numbers, don't use 0, 1, or 2, just because they can do some weird math, like dividing by 0 is going to cause problems. You can do a lot of stuff with 1 and get the same answer, so it's not going to help you differentiate between answers. 2 is usually fine, but there are a few cases where you'll plug in 2 and it'll work for a few answer choices. So generally, I start with 3 or higher. The only exception to that is if your answer choices are inequalities, just you can pick anything within that range of the inequality. Do plug your answers in or your numbers into all the answer choices, just in case you happen to pick the one number that works for multiple. It's rare, but it does happen. And if so, then just pick a new number and narrow down from those that still worked until there's only one. So let's look at a classic example where I see that is equivalent to I was talking about, and expressions in the answer choice. So if I don't know how to rewrite that x to the 2/3 into one of these formats, I'm fine. I don't need to know that. Because if I just make up a number for x, I'm going to say 3. Then if I put 3 into this and 3 into these, if it's equivalent, I should get the same thing. So let's start by putting 3 in for x here. So what's 3 raised to 2/3? 2.08. Okay, now I'm going to go and put 3 in for each of these, and I'll go ahead and do the math for you. Here's what you get. So 3 squared over 3 gives me 3. For g, 3 times 2 over 3 gives me 2, and so on. And if you look at these, they all give me different things until you get to k, which gives me 2.08. That's the same thing that this gave me, which I'm trying to be equivalent to. So this and this are equivalent, it's k. So I didn't have to know how to do the math they were testing. I just made up some numbers, plugged it into what I want, and then put into all my answers to see which one gave me the same thing. That's how you would make up numbers. Let's look at a much later problem. Again, with this trig stuff that I was talking about with the plug in your answers. And this is going to be a mixture of the two, plugging in the answers they give you and making up numbers. Here, I'm trying to figure out for what values in this range will sine of theta, if you take its absolute value, be greater than or equal to 1, with these as my options. So I see here I have inequalities, so that's where I think, okay, make up numbers. But here I have exact numbers, so that's where I think plug in answers. So I'm going to mix them. Empty set, by the way, just means that there are none. So this is never ever true. If that's the case, then you're going to choose empty set. So first, I'm going to plug in answers because I have some exact options. I'm going to pick one of these and try it out. So let's try negative pi over 2, just because if that works, I can get rid of both of these. Well, not both, but I can get rid of b. Whereas if I tried positive pi over 2 and it worked, well, I wouldn't be able to get rid of either because it's in both of them. So if I put negative pi over 2 into this, so absolute value of sine of negative pi over 2, you get 1. Is that greater than or equal to 1? Yes, it is. So negative pi over 2 should be in my answer choice. So now I can get rid of b because that doesn't have it. I can get rid of c because it doesn't say or equal to. And I can get rid of e because that said there's nothing. So now I'm down to a and d. So it wouldn't do me any good to plug in pi over 2 because that's in both of them. So I now have to pick something that's within this range of d that is not in a. So here, since I have an inequality, the easiest one would just be 0 because that's in between these two and not in here. So if I choose 0 and plug it in, sine of 0, take the absolute value, I get 0. Is that greater than or equal to 1? No. So this inequality does not work. So I can get rid of d, and it has to be a. So again, I did not need to know any of the trig rules that they're testing here. I can just make up numbers and plug in my answer choices. All right, finally, the last strategy is just going to be drawing some simple shapes. It's what it sounds like. We're just going to break up complicated shapes into some simpler ones. We're going to add lines, rearrange diagrams, and just make simple shapes. When do I do this? If you haven't figured that out, it's when I have a complicated shape or diagram. Just general tips. Right triangles are your best friend. That's the most commonly tested shape, so make sure you know your Pythagorean theorem. They will test that, and we can use it more than you would think. And just one little tip in case it comes up. If you have a circle, and they give you the radius drawn on there, you can draw that radius wherever you want. As long as it goes from the center to the outside, it's the radius and it'll be the same length. And you can use that to maybe make a triangle or some other shape. And I'll give you an example here at the end of this video of what I mean by that. But let's start with the simplest example out there. Notice this is later in the test, where they're giving you all this complicated wording, they're giving you a function with a weird shape, and they want to know what's the area in this section here. Well, the good news is I can just do something simple by breaking this up into 4 or 3 shapes depending on what you know. Generally, I would recommend 4. Notice I can just draw a straight line down right there, here, and across here. And now I have a triangle, a rectangle, and a triangle. And I can use these points to figure out what the length of each side is. Now I can get the area of each of those and just add them up, and I'll have the area under here. So while they thought they were testing something super complicated, really, I just have to know how do I get the area of a triangle and a rectangle, which is the kind of thing they would test in the first 10 problems. And instead, I'm using that at question 49. Now, when I said you could also break it up into 3, if you happen to know the area of a trapezoid, you can leave it like that. And now I have just 3 shapes, a triangle, a rectangle, and a trapezoid. But you generally don't have to bother with the trapezoid equation because you can just break a trapezoid into rectangles and triangles. So I won't solve this all the way out. I just wanted to show this is what I'm talking about, where you're just going to break this into shapes, get the area of each and add them up, and that will give you your answer. Here's another good example of one where most people wouldn't think to make a right triangle, and that's a distance formula, which, hey, if you've got it memorized, great. This is an easy one to just solve with the distance formula. But you're trying to memorize a whole bunch of things, so I usually don't recommend bothering to memorize the distance formula if you don't already have it, because the distance formula is the same thing as the Pythagorean theorem. Using this as an example, if they wanted the distance between these 2 points, well, if I was to draw that line and then use the grid lines, I could draw a triangle, like so. And notice that's a right triangle, so I can just use Pythagorean theorem. And if I use the points, see x went from 1 to 4, so from here to here, it went 3. Y went from 2 to 3, so from here to here, it went up 1. There are my sides. I can now use the Pythagorean theorem to get the hypotenuse, which would be the distance. And there you go. Don't need the distance formula. I just draw a right triangle, and I'll use Pythagorean theorem, which I should already know for the ACT. And if you're wondering, if you were to just replace 3 with x2 minus x1, because that's how I got the 3, and replace that 1 with y2 minus y1, because that's how I got the 1, and solve that out for the hypotenuse, you would get the distance formula. That's what that is. It's just the Pythagorean theorem solved for the hypotenuse. Fun fact. So here's a really weird example that I've seen a few times, so I recreated it here. And it gives you that example of what I was talking about with a circle. So to walk you through what all this is saying, I have a circle, I have 2 parallel lines going through it, and they tell me this middle one goes through the center. So E is the center of the circle. And they want to know what's the distance between B and E. So what's that length there? And all they give me is the length of this line, which is 8, and the length of this line, which is 10. So how on earth will you do this? Well, start out by realizing DE, since E is the center, this is the radius. DF is the diameter. But this radius, I could redraw it wherever I wanted. So let's say, for whatever reason, I wanted to put it here, I could. It would be the same length. If I put it here, I could. It's still going to be the same length. As long as it goes from the center of the circle to anywhere on the outside, it's the same length because it's the radius. So, if I realize I want this length here, that's what they're asking, what happens if I was just redraw DE right here? It's still the radius. So I know the length of DE because they told me DF is 10. It's going through a circle, so halfway is going to be 5. So I know that's going to be 5, and I'm trying to solve for this side, so let's draw that. And what do I have? A right triangle. I know that length is 5 because that's the radius. They told me AC is 8. It's cut in half. So that would mean this is 4. This is 5. I can use the Pythagorean theorem now. And there you go. That crazy weird problem just comes down to the Pythagorean theorem yet again. If you're wondering, there's the math for it. Just to prove it can be done, you get 3. But I won't go into that to save time, but I just wanted to give an example of, again, if you're creative with drawing weird shapes and simplifying things, you can solve some very complicated problems. But I'll stop there so I don't take too much more of your time, and we'll go into more in future videos. Again, if you found it helpful, leave a like, subscribe to help me out, and I'll see you in the next video.